We're looking at the value of diversity and inclusion from my perspective. So I want to start off with the business case for diversity and inclusion. And as HR professionals, which I believe most of us are, we've heard this business case many times. We've heard it over and over, and it does change and it adjusts. It's up to us to really lead that change, drive that business case, constantly be talking about it, and to lead our leaders and our managers into the next level, following that next level of expertise. So that's really our job. And so just that business case for diversity and inclusion is really about, really essentially a diverse and inclusive workplace is a more successful workplace, whether it's a nonprofit organization or a company. There's actually a McKinsey study out recently that talks a lot about the increased revenue related to diversity. So organizations that have a focus on gender and racial diversity actually have a 15% on gender and a 35% higher revenue income over their industry's median. And so that's across, I think, North America, mostly the US studies. And so that's so important to know that there actually is a dollar value to doing D&I right. Now, the challenge with that is the return on investment for each individual initiative is very difficult to identify. And that's because a lot of the impact, a lot of that change is actually indirect. So while it's important to do it, and we know that doing diversity and inclusion and having those initiatives is important, it is still difficult to specifically put a dollar amount in advance to those initiatives for people. So there's also a lot of change going on in our society right now, and the talk around diversity and inclusion is so much at the forefront that I think this conversation is really important, and I do hope that you take this as my perspective, and again, kind of reflect on it and think about your own experience, your own everything that you've done in your life and how it got you to where you are and how that might influence how you see the world. Some of the other benefits to doing diversity and inclusion right, and we know are, the employees, we should be hiring employees that represent the market that we serve. And Canada is a very diverse place, so it's important that we do that. When we hire diverse employees, we're also getting just that quality. You're getting a different level of quality. You're getting much more innovation when you have people who don't all think the same or who have grown up in the same way. There's, you avoid higher turnover because employees feel like they actually belong and they're valued in an organization. Better decisions get made in the boardroom, and the company's perception from the outside, from the public, is actually increased. Some of the costs on the flip side to not doing diversity and inclusion properly are, the actual legal costs of a human rights claim for discrimination. There's, customers that you're missing out on because they don't feel heard or valued, or your product or your service you're offering isn't really, something that they need or want. And then there's also that turnover cost. So the actual termination, the separation cost, the replacement cost, there's training, everything of that is involved in that. And we often think for every position we have to replace, the cost in 1 year is often triple what that annual salary is. So think about that from a numbers perspective. And finally, there's the lost productivity when employees just really don't feel valued or that they're that they belong or they feel included in an organization. So that's diversity and inclusion. When we look at the Indigenous world from an HR perspective, some of the things that I've noticed that are important to think about are, the history and the governance, right? And so there's also jurisdictions, leadership styles, and then also the ties to community and to family. So when we talk about the history and the governance, what I'm talking about is this 500-year history that Indigenous peoples have with mainstream Western societies, right? And this constant having to learn and to adapt. And it's been, it's had its very rough periods throughout this time. And, there are periods where there's a lot of hope and a lot of people are making efforts in order to repair and to reconcile and move beyond a lot of things. And some of the most recent things that are still impacting our workplaces even are the legacy of residential schools and that intergenerational trauma. And then the 60s scoop where children were just taken from their home and put in foster homes with no explanation. Really, these things were things that were meant to get rid of the culture and to assimilate Indigenous people into kind of the Western culture. So I think that history is really important when you consider working either with or for an Indigenous organization. is to understand that culture and where that might be coming from. Another part of that governance piece is First Nations, for example, are considered sovereign nations. They are not a provincial or a municipal body. They're not a town. They work with Canada and with the provinces on a nation-to-nation basis, and that adds in some real complex, relationship and governance pieces that we need to take into account. So whether you're working with an urban Aboriginal organization or a First Nation government or a First Nation-owned organization, there's all sorts of these things that we need to be aware of that may impact how the relationship works and what we do. When we look at jurisdictions, so on a First Nation perspective, for example, so we're looking at reserves, which are specific areas that the government has designated as First Nation reserves. They don't actually fall under provincial employment legislation, so from an HR perspective, it's quite complex. They don't also, however, only fall under federal jurisdiction. So when you're working with a First Nation or First Nation-owned organization, you actually need to be working with both federal and provincial legislation. And so from an HR perspective, those of us who work closely with legislation know how complex one can be, let alone both. And there just aren't enough court cases that go through to really make definitive answers on a lot of these things. So it's quite a complex world to work in. When we talk about leadership styles, Indigenous cultures are very much about community. It's about the group succeeding and working together and discussing and dialoguing and value of relationships. And that can be very different than mainstream organization leadership, which is sometimes can be very individual and very competitive. And so if you add that on top of the fact that Indigenous organizations have had this, this residential school legacy, the 60 scoop, who don't necessarily know how to lead in their own way, also having to learn and adapt and work with mainstream organizations as well. So there's this added challenge of this leadership style and kind of this internal struggle to self-identify from a leadership capacity, but also having to learn and adapt to another way of working. And finally, that kind of ties in with the relationships that Indigenous communities have, and that the family is so important. And that really ties in as well into things like conflict of interest from an HR perspective. One of the positives of that, though, is that Indigenous companies, Indigenous organizations, have a truly personally vested interest in the outcomes of that organization. I think because of this close connection with communities. So there's really some really interesting things. So none of these are really meant to be negatives. I'm sharing them with you in a way that you will hopefully get to see a little bit of that perspective from what I see and how I've seen these things from an HR lens. So the second objective I want to do with you is to give you 3 examples. And these are 3 examples where I've seen Indigenous organizations and mainstream organizations value some employee assets differently. So what I mean by that, so I have my first example, so lived experience versus formal education is one, and I'll give you an example that hopefully helps you see that from my perspective. Developing in role versus having experience when you start a job. That's another difference that I've definitely seen. And then conflict of interest, and I mentioned this just a few minutes ago, is such a complex thing when you're working with a First Nation especially. So if we look at that first objective, lived experience versus formal education. So from an HR perspective, we put a lot of emphasis on job analysis, on job descriptions, on measurable objective criteria for job postings. We build matrices for interviews. We have knockout questions built into systems. And we have all of this because we're trying very hard to figure out a way to deal with all of this information and data. When we have jobs posted, there are so many people applying from such a varied experience. These things that are put into place in some of our systems are meant to help us be efficient in making the right decision in order to get the best candidate. And I'll come back to the definition of the best candidate here in a bit. We get all of this information and we as humans, we can't process it. It's just too much information. And that goes back when we were running from predators, and just didn't have time to sit and process every bit of data. We had to make decisions quickly based on what we saw in the moment, and so we still have that. We don't right now have live predators chasing us down the street, but we're making decisions. We have data, we have the internet, we have data, information coming at us from everywhere so fast, and we need to make these decisions so quickly. And so this is a different kind of threat that we're now living in. So this is a bit of that legacy on the bias. So I want to go back to what does best really mean. I'm going to give you an example of a discussion that I had. So early in my career, I was working in oil and gas, and one of my tasks was to improve the diversity and inclusion metrics. Okay? So imagine this plant. I worked in this plant. There were 400 employees. We had about 180 process operators. And if you imagine process operators, and a process operator told me this example, I didn't come up with this. Imagine Homer Simpson sitting at his desk, pushing buttons, kind of hanging out most of the time, only not for nuclear. Okay, and that's how they defined really what a process operator job could be. So 180 of these guys. Most of them have gone to school in the same town that they currently work in. Their fathers have as well, and they've kind of worked there. We had people who were celebrating on the regular 44 years with the same company as an operator. So this is the environment we're in. So there was also about 180 engineers, and about 75 kind of maintenance people, admin people, management, that kind of thing. So this is the environment that we're in. So we're doing recruitment, and for these process operators, we would bring in about 20 to 40 co-op students every year, and we would hire about 10 just to replace everybody who was retiring. And so doing co-ops is great. The whole program, they need 2 8-month co-ops to graduate. So in recruitment, we have 3 candidates. We have one candidate who has the best possible marks of any student. Is he the best candidate? I'll let you think about that one. The second candidate did both of his 8-month co-ops with the company. His dad works there. His dad put in a good word with management. That's probably why he got in. His marks are okay. He's there. He's, got 16 months now of experience with the organization. Is he the best candidate? Or the third candidate, let's say, is a 35-year-old man. He's just also graduated from the same program. He may or may not have done his co-ops with us. His marks aren't necessarily the best. But he's coming from an Indigenous community. He's coming from the neighboring First Nation community just next door. So he's much older. He's a mature student, I'll say, compared to the younger guy who's in his early 20s. And that's because he didn't have good role models growing up. He didn't have men who had good jobs who could really, tell him about how the process worked and about how refineries work and how you go about getting a job in the refinery. His grades weren't great in high school, so he didn't have the necessary chemical grades to actually get in to the CPET program. And so he spent a few years trying to figure out what he was doing with his life, what he wanted to do. He ended up deciding to go back to school, upgrading his high school before doing a few other odd jobs, and then finally being able to go back to college to finish this 4-year program. In the meantime, he started a young family, as people do in their 20s. So now he has had to work part-time while going to school at the same time. Is he the best candidate? Right? So this is this question between the 3 candidates. The discussion that we had around this was, the third candidate, what he has is a passion to learn, a desire. He actually, had part-time jobs while he was going to school, did the research, learned what he wanted to do. He is devoted to having a good career and, working really hard to have a better life for his kid who that he didn't have, right? He wants to be a good role model for his children growing up. And so where in our recruitment process currently, and I want you to reflect on this, where in that recruitment process is that recognized? Okay. Some organizations do have diversity and inclusion recruitment specialists, and a lot of what they do is actually helping people work through these complex recruitment processes so that everybody, all 3 of these candidates, if they wanted, could get to the interview stage and have that chance to have the conversation with the hiring manager. As of when we were doing this actual hiring, that wasn't an option for this particular situation. Okay. So as I said, I do want you to reflect on that. Okay, and that comes down to the question of again, kind of what does best mean? There is no answer. I don't have an answer to that question, but it's having that discussion that's important, right? and really thinking about what does that mean for the organization, where is the organization going, what is that strategic plan, and really trying to tie those together. So what I'd like you to do is just to think about your own processes, your own recruitment processes, your own experiences, where maybe have you seen these things, and how can we think differently and have those kind of conversations. So the second example that I want to share with you is about development in role versus having experience when you start a job. And any young person starting a job, there's always that catch-22, right? You must have 5 years of experience before having this job, but how do you get the job if you don't have the 5 years of experience? And this goes on. So what I want to share is on a First Nation, for example, as I mentioned, a First Nation is a sovereign nation. They are literally the government. So they have a lot of complex jobs. They run the water treatment, the road maintenance, they do the health services, hospitals, the daycares, the schools. All of these things are all run by the government. So there's also obviously the government administration, finance. They do child welfare and protection, as well as mental health and crisis. They have the fire departments. So there's literally everything is run out of a First Nation, and it may be a very small community as well. And so if you kind of combine all of these complex jobs with the fact that most communities are remote. In my own community, we're an hour from the nearest hospital by boat. And so, people who would choose to work at the communities will have to drive at least an hour every day in Northern Ontario in that weather. So the example I want to share with you is I'm currently right now training a new role they've created. It's an executive assistant / HR. So I'm training this person on how to be HR on site. And so she's learning all of these things. She's not an HR professional. She's actually, her previous job at the First Nation was actually the addictions counselor. Okay, so addictions into HR and an executive assistant, all right. What is she actually trained in though? Biochem. So this situation, this is not unusual in a First Nation organization. Oftentimes, we have talent that we need to be able to use and to develop them in role versus expecting somebody to come in with the education and the experience required right away. And so when we look, as HR professionals, regardless of Indigenous or not, oftentimes people are thrown into a situation and it's sink or swim. New job, you start a new job, good, day one, go. And people kind of have to figure it out. And so that sometimes can be the reality in an Indigenous organization. And what I want you to think about in that example is what processes do you have or what relationships do you have with maybe communities or organizations that maybe that is the case? And how can you maybe think about things differently and ask some different questions? Okay. The third example I want to talk about is conflict of interest. So I've mentioned a few times that families and community is really the important piece for an Indigenous organization. I want to take you back to my community. There's 400 total members, but about 200 people actually live on reserve. We'll say, 25% of them are kids, right? So they go to school. There are some that have jobs off reserve, so they have to do that 1 hour commute, at least 1 hour to go in to find a job. Or sometimes they go and they live in town during the week and they come back on the weekends. And then there's about 20 people who work for local businesses, so marinas and stores and services and that kind of thing. And then about 40 people actually work for the First Nation. So imagine 200 people live on this community entirely, 40 of them work for the First Nation, so in one organization. The example that I want to share, let me tell you a bit more about actually the community. So this community, so out of the 200 people, there's 4 main family groups, and there's also 5 elected officials. So there's all these different things happening with, we'll say 175 people or 150 people because some of them are kids. And out of that, obviously there's going to be overlap in these different roles. So out of the 40 people who work at the First Nation, many of them are also elected officials. Right? So there's that kind of divide between administration and governance. Many of them are spouses and brothers and sisters, and their kids work there. There's multiple generations. This is all working in one office. It would be ridiculously inefficient to entirely eliminate any conflict of interest. I think it would probably be impossible, and it wouldn't make any sense for the community. And so when we're looking at these things, the example that I have is we were doing some recruitment, and the best candidate was actually the spouse of the hiring manager. Okay? And so what do you do in that case? So from an HR perspective, you would think, okay, well, you can't really do that unless they're in a different department. But that wasn't possible in this situation. So we ended up bringing that person on, but we had to mitigate those conflicts, right? So when we think of conflict of interest, you're thinking perceived, actual potential conflicts, right? So all of these things. So we had to take a look at all of these pieces of the conflict, list out all of the different risks, and then different ways that we were going to mitigate each of these risks. So what we ended up doing, bringing on the spouse, but we had them reporting in any kind of financial reporting, ended up being to a different person. So that was easy to readjust. Any of the performance management stuff, so we actually ended up upgrading the performance management and the personnel policies so that there was a way to go to somebody else if you couldn't go to your direct supervisor. And so these are all things that we did, and we had them all documented, and they were signed off by council in order to mitigate that potential conflict, well, that actual conflict. And so I share these examples with you again as a way to think of, you know, just because we've been taught something one way or we've always done something one way doesn't mean it's the right way. And I also challenge you to think about the understanding different cultures and how that might actually help an organization become stronger. So in this case, we were able to give a local person a job, which is amazing for his family, his kids, his own personal development, his own self-esteem. And he didn't have to do that 1 hour commute every day. And so being able to do that, you know, he ends up becoming a better, more committed employee as well. So from those 3 detailed examples, I wanted to share those with you again, just to share some of that stuff from my perspective and working from an Indigenous organization on what that might look like. So what I do want to share here too next are some of the failures. Okay? So I've shared with you some details. Hopefully you can see that from someone else's shoes. Some of the failures, and as I've said, people are complex. We're humans, we work with humans, we know this in HR. People are always doing things that we don't expect them to do, and that is our lives, and that's how, you know, that's what we sign up for when we get into HR. And so with that comes the fact that you have to be able to admit that you have done things wrong and that you've made mistakes. The good thing about that is being able to learn from them. And so what I want to share these with you so that you can reflect on that and hopefully learn and maybe not make some of the same mistakes that I've made in the past. Okay. So my first example here of a failure is using the word stakeholder. We use this in business all the time, the word stakeholder. That is, in my experience when I was there, I was told that that was actually quite offensive to a First Nation. And that goes back to the fact that they're sovereign bodies working nation to nation. They're not stakeholders, they're rights holders. So a handy book, if we go back to Bob Joseph and his 23, it's a free download. That you can actually download this short ebook, but 23 things to not say or do about working effectively with Indigenous peoples, and this is the first one. Don't use the word stakeholder. And I did learn that the hard way, although that did lead me to find his book. So really that worked out well. Another example is kind of forcing a process versus building a relationship. And in Indigenous cultures, building that relationship is much more important than getting the job done. And there was a scenario where I was working with a community and the chief wanted to meet me in person before we could actually get ahead and start working on this work, even though all of the work I was doing was virtual. And so to me, I thought, okay, let's just have a Zoom call, we'll talk about it, we'll meet, we can see each other. And that was not an acceptable way to do that for him. So he actually ended up holding back some of the work we were doing until I was able to come up and to meet him. And I've learned a lot from that. And so important thing about asking about that kind of thing up front. Another example here that I have is in a day-long session with an Indigenous organization. It is so important to have lunch with that group. So food is family and food are 2 of the main important things in Indigenous culture, and lunch is almost always catered, and often it's a local person who's actually just made it and brought it in. And that is just so important to spend that hour with the group, regardless of what you're talking about. You might be having a very complex, stressed, sensitive discussion before and after, but when it's lunch, it's lunch. And that's where people get to talk about things. And I think this is part of working in a culture where people are family, right? They are very close with each other outside of work, and they can oftentimes compartmentalize that and be like, okay, that was work, now it's lunch. And so spending that time not booking another meeting or a phone call in between on your lunch break and actually spending time with the group is a really important thing to do. Credentials. This ties back to my first example about kind of that formal education. It's been recommended to me to leave my credentials off my name tag when I go and talk to people in an Indigenous organization. And it's much more respectful to ask people about their experience than about where they went to school. Okay? Again, these are some of the things that I learned the hard way. Another thing as well, if you're working with organizations, and I've experienced this myself, and I've really tried to think about how I do it, but in my organization I worked with, where we actually only had 1% Aboriginal population out of 400. It was myself and another guy who self-identified. He had concerns about becoming kind of the token native at events. He was asked to go to every career fair, to every external event. He was asked to hang out with the GM, and that there's kind of this line, and I don't have an answer for you on where that is, but being aware that that's not necessarily a good thing for that person. And so how do you have that discussion? And to be honest, he and I had that discussion to say, are you okay with this? Because if you're not, we can push back. And so I think as HR, it's important that we recognize that and we do have that open conversation to try to understand how that person feels about being treated as, and the intents are positive. The organization was treating this positively, but it may not come across that way to that person necessarily. And I think a final example I'll leave you with here of one of my failures is I was in an organization, I was in a community in the north, and the receptionist asked me where I was from, and I told her what I told you earlier, and she spoke to me in her language and then refused to speak to me in English at all. And I don't know her language, I don't know my own language. And so to me, at first I was kind of offended and a little upset about that, but it really occurred to me afterwards that that was kind of her way of saying that I didn't have any authority over her on her territory and her community. And I thought about that afterwards, and I reflect on that now to think, well, how was my behavior when I talked to her? Was I being respectful? She was an elder as well, so, and I think back on that, and I'm not exactly sure what the answer is, but I would definitely approach that differently next time. I do want to share 2 successes. It's not all bad. 2 things that have gone really well from an Indigenous HR perspective is when I'm doing workplace investigations is the ability to learn, to listen. And that's a really important thing in Indigenous culture, especially with elders, is to listen and let them talk. Even if there's a pause, just listening. And that goes a really long way when doing workplace investigations. And finally, I was really lucky enough to take part in a blanket exercise. If you haven't had the opportunity to do one, and you do get invited, I really recommend you go into it with kind of an open mind. But I was invited along with some community members and some senior leaders in the industry and in my organization, non-Indigenous, and the community was Indigenous, and they hosted this blanket exercise, which is really about kind of walking through that 500-year history in 45 minutes. And it is so impactful, and it really puts the person in somebody else's shoes, and just the sharing that people had afterwards about how that made them feel and the impact on them. And these are people I'd worked with for years who were sharing these things that they thought they knew what it was like, and they had no idea until that day. So I do really highly recommend that you do that, and I think that has made, even for myself personally, had a huge impact. So those are some of the successes. So in summary, what I'm sharing these with you for is, as I said, for you to see HR, to see diversity and inclusion from a different perspective. And I've shared my perspective. I want to reiterate, this is my own. I am one person. This is not universal truths, and I really do want you to reflect on your own perspective, your own identity, how you got there, how that's perceived professionally, personally. And I do want you to reach out to your network. I want you to think about who do you know that has stories that they can share that maybe you have never asked before. So your professional network, your family, your friends, and try to really understand how that can impact you and what you can learn from that and take it back to your organizations.